Hi everyone and welcome to this video. This time I'm going to talk to you about a little holiday I took over Easter and the week after in Callander, Scotland, in Perthshire, about 16 miles to the northwest of Stirling. My cousin Clive had arranged to stay in a holiday rental property for him and a number of his Munro bagging friends. There was a space available, so I decided to go for it. It was very comfortable and handy for the local Tesco Express. The first full day was Easter Sunday. I woke up fairly early, so I nipped out with a fairly big lens on my camera to see what wildlife I could find. Our house is right next to the Rob Roy Trail, which is a sort of cycle route which goes all over the area. Where we were, the Rob Roy Trail followed the tracks of the old Callander and Oban Railway, which connected Callander to Killin in the north before the track headed west to Oban. Sadly, it is no more. There was also another railway that linked Callander to Dunblane, known rather unimaginatively as the Callander, Doon and Dunblane Railway. Here's a map to show you the general arrangement of things. Note that the stretch between Oban and Crianlarich is still present, but the train now comes up on the west side of Loch Lomond to go through Crianlarich. Anyway, back to the birdies. Not sure about this one. Anyway, with breakfast out of the way, Bill and I headed north up the valley until we reached Loch Earn Head at the western end of Loch Earn, hence the name. Here we intended to walk along a stretch of the old Callander to Oban railway line, which eventually passes over a fairly impressive viaduct. And what do you know? There it is. South of this point, the line runs along a shelf cut into the side of the mountain, which was expensive. To continue to do so would have meant some extremely sharp turns, so this viaduct was made, which takes the line away from the side of the mountain, only to rejoin further north. Anyway, if you push on a bit further north, there's more signs of the railway to be found, but then we pushed on north to the Ben Lawers Nature Reserve. Ben Lawers is the highest mountain in the southern part of the Highlands and the 10th highest mountain in the whole of Scotland, or possibly the 9th, depending on who you ask. But it was very cold that day, so we decided not to climb it. Yeah, that was definitely the reason. Instead, we went to look at Lawers Dam, part of a hydroelectric scheme that's been here since the 50s. Then Bill took us on a search for Garth House, which used to be a youth hostel that he stayed at many moons ago. It is no longer a hostel, and since it is in some disrepair, the owners are doing it up. At nearby Fortingall, they have a hotel with a tiny and somewhat expensive bar, an old church, and what is reputed to be one of the oldest yew trees in Britain, if not the world. Estimates seem to vary between 1500 and 9,000 years, so it's anybody's guess really. And that's about it. Back to Callander for tea. So, Easter Monday, and the weather didn't look too brilliant, so Clive, Bill, and myself decided to go to Stirling Castle. But first, some more birdies. So now we're off to Stirling Castle. And there it is. First, a potted history of Stirling Castle. It stands on an extinct volcano that erupted 350 million years ago. Two sides of the volcano are nearly vertical, making it an ideal place to site a stronghold. The surrounding hills forced anyone travelling between North and South Scotland to pass near Stirling, making it a strategically important location. The castle also controlled the most convenient crossing of the Forth River. There was probably a fortification here 3,000 years ago, but little evidence exists. Written evidence does, however, exist of a royal castle that existed around 1110 under the rule of Alexander I of Scotland. Aye, fit like. The king, his court, and his administrators would have lived in or around the castle. The buildings would have been divided between three terraces on the summit, as they are today, and would have been made from timber, with the exception of the chapel, which would have been stone. William I of Scotland was forced to surrender the castle to Henry II of England in 1174 in order to obtain his freedom. However, English forces never occupied the castle. William had revolted against Henry, but had been captured at the Battle of Alnwick and imprisoned. He was forced to submit to Henry, and the castle formed part of his ransom. England and Scotland had been getting on pretty well for a long time when, in 1286, Alexander III, King of Scotland, died. There was no clear heir to the throne, and Edward I of England visited Stirling in 1291 in order to adjudicate. He plumped for John Balliol, who became king the following year. However, nobles in the Scottish court sealed a treaty with France in opposition to England in 1295. This annoyed Edward a great deal and kicked off the so-called Wars of Independence and earned Edward the nickname Hammer of the Scots. King John lost his crown and Stirling Castle was captured by the English. However, in the following year the Scots recaptured the castle at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Not to be outdone, Edward recaptured the castle in 1298 following the Battle of Falkirk. And so it went on. Edward I died in 1307 and was succeeded by his son, Edward II. But Stirling Castle was still in English hands in 1313. King Robert the Bruce's younger brother, Edward, laid siege to Stirling and reached an understanding with Sir Philip Mowbray, the garrison captain, that the castle would be surrendered to the Scots if it had not been relieved by the English by Midsummer's Day 1314. The English king, Edward II, and his army were soundly defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn in boggy ground 2 miles to the south of Stirling Castle by Robert the Bruce and his army. Stirling Castle was retaken. And then it was taken by the English again in 1336, and the Scots got it back in 1342. After the Wars of Independence finished, things settled down a bit, and the Scots managed to hang on to Stirling Castle. In the next 300 years or so, the Stuart dynasty got itself established, and eventually James VI was asked to take the throne of England and Scotland, at which point he seemed to have lost all interest in Stirling Castle. Anyway, enough history. Today, as you enter the castle, you pass through the outer defences and eventually reach this forework. This was built during James IV's reign, around 1500. The stone walls on the left and right of this picture and the outer defences were built much later, in the reign of Queen Anne in the early 1700s. The Unicorn Cafe came later still. This picture is taken from the Queen Anne Garden, which lies outside the boundary of the early castle. However, it is thought that the garden may have been present even before the addition of the outer defences. Originally, the forework would have been even more impressive, extending to 5 stories in height, and the towers would have been capped with pointy bits, which is the technical term for conical roofs. Furthermore, there would have been 2 additional towers on either side of the gateway. The base of one of these towers can still be seen in the garden. If you head through the gateway, you reach the outer close, the first of the castle's courtyards. If you look to the north, over the ramparts, you can see the Wallace Monument, a perfectly positioned 67-metre high tower, which was completed in 1869. It was paid for by public subscription and also donations from various foreign donors, including Giuseppe Garibaldi. At the westernmost end of the courtyard is the North Gate, the oldest surviving building in the castle, dating back to the 1300s. Facing north-northeast, over the battlements, is the peachy-coloured Great Hall, completed in 1503 for James IV. Set further back, to the left of the Great Hall, is the palace, commissioned by James V, who may not have lived to see it completed. If you turn left to look back at the gateway, a more modern building can be seen. I think this is the Fort Major's house, which would have been added when Stirling Castle was the home of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in the early part of the 19th century. There is a gap between the Great Hall and the palace. If you pass through this gap, you reach the inner close, the second of the castle's courtyards. The northern side is bounded by the southern wall of the Great Hall. I assume the veranda is a fairly modern addition. Refreshments are available. The eastern side is the western wall of the palace. There are a number of statues fairly high up on the wall, which have survived rather better than those on the more exposed eastern side of the palace. This is a statue of Venus, the goddess of love. Not sure about this one. Here is Saturn, god of time and agriculture. Goddess of plenty, maybe, or Flora, goddess of spring and flowers. Not sure. There's quite a lot of other carving in all the nooks and crannies around the inner court, and also along the northern wall of the palace, although these seem to be somewhat more worn. On the southern side of the inner close is the King's Old Building. James IV had this built to use as his own lodging. It was completed around 1496, incorporating parts of older buildings. Originally, the main apartments were on the first floor and were reached by climbing a spiral stair within the tower with the octagonal roof. Furthermore, these apartments originally continued all the way up to the roof and had much larger windows, but substantial modifications were made starting from the late 1600s. It is now the museum of the 5th Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland, formerly known as the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Turning clockwise to face west, you will be facing the Chapel Royal. This was built in 1594 on the orders of James VI for the baptism of his son Henry. It is said that the ceiling decoration was gold, the walls were covered with paintings and adorned with sculptures appropriate to a baptism. However, the chapel fell out of use and was redecorated in 1603 in preparation for a coronation visit by Charles I. Later still, the building was used by the military. The interior decoration we see today dates from the 1930s. If you turn clockwise again to face south, you will see the Great Hall. Completed in 1503 as part of James IV's modifications, it reused stones from an earlier tower and served as a space for state events. It was also used as a dining hall for the servants. A pair of projecting bay windows provides plenty of light at the end of the room with the dais where the king and queen would sit. Now for a wander around the palace, which lies on the east side of the inner close, but is entered through a passage on the south side of the outer close and an enclosed courtyard. This is the Queen's Outer Hall. This is one of the more public spaces and served as a waiting room for those wishing to see Mary of Guise, James V's wife. It would also be used as a dining room and for entertaining. The red wall decoration is based on examples at nearby Kinneil House. The Queen's bedchamber is more sumptuously decorated. The ceiling is adorned with the arms of the Guise family in gold leaf. Brocaded cloth of gold lines the walls, and Persian carpets are placed on the floor. Everything is kept spick and span by a long-serving cleaner. The highlight is the set of tapestries known as the Hunter the Unicorn. Likenesses of these can be found on many of the souvenirs, especially the tapestry known as the Unicorn in Captivity. The tapestries you see were commissioned by Historic Scotland. The originals, woven in the 1500s, are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The King's lodgings come next, consisting of the King's inner hall and the bedchamber. Here we find this nattily dressed fellow and also some beautifully decorated, handmade reproduction furniture. The triptych seen here seems to have been moved from the Queen's bedchamber, at least according to my guidebook. The painted ceiling of the King's bedchamber has alternating panels showing James V's crown and his royal cipher. The cipher looks like the number 15, but I think it is actually a letter I followed by the digit 5. The I indicates James, since I and J were used interchangeably at the time. There are also ceiling bosses that represent the 4 chivalric orders that James belonged to. I found the arms of St. Michael, representing France, and the Scottish thistle, but I'm not sure about the Order of the Garter or the Golden Fleece of Burgundy. This appears to be the arms of Castile and Leon. I'm not sure why that is there. If you look up when in the King's inner hall, you will find the ceiling is covered with the so-called Stirling heads. These colourful circular carvings are reproductions. They would have passed on various messages to those waiting in the inner hall for an audience with James V. For example, James's right to rule is emphasised by positioning his image near to that of his mother, Margaret Tudor, and the English monarch, Henry VIII. Powerful allies are also present, such as Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Chivalric values are represented by the portrayal of worthies, fabled embodiments of virtue and honour. Roman emperors are also present, designed to suggest that James was also a political and military leader of note. Hercules can also be found, the ultimate moral man. If you visit the upper floor of the palace, you can see some of the original Stirling heads. They have lost most of their paint, but are impressive nonetheless, and in remarkably good condition, considering they were once on a ceiling that collapsed around 1777. Afterwards, the heads found their way to various individuals, but thankfully records were kept and all but 10 of the heads were recovered. Well, that's about it for Stirling Castle. After a quick visit to the nearest Sainsbury's, we headed for the Wallace Monument, which can be seen from Stirling Castle's ramparts. From the car park and gift shop, it's a short, steep walk to the top of the hill on which the monument is based. Unfortunately, standing so near is probably not the best way to see the monument. We arrived too late to climb to the top of the monument, but there were some wooden statues to compensate. After that, it was back to Callander. It was Bill's birthday, so we had a cake. Several cakes, actually. Well, that's it for now. I did go off on a bit of a tangent there. I went on about Stirling Castle a little bit longer than I thought, but this video is already long enough, so I shall put the rest in another video. Keep an eye out for it. I hope to get round to it sooner rather than later. That's all. Bye.